What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are doing everything wiring related, from installing our brand new pre-made wiring harness from KPower, as well as our Haltech Elite 1500 standalone ECU. Let's do it. Let's get started by taking a look at the wiring harness off of the car. We can talk about all of the sensors. Obviously, I'll be showing you guys this as we go along, but just to sort of clarify what all of these different connectors are for. Everything is, sort of cut to a very precise length. So that is just helpful by default. If this sensor here by my pinky doesn't reach as far out to this, then it doesn't connect to that. And also the fact that most of these sensors are very different, where you've got like a 3-pin, a long 6-pin, everything is, not every single one of these is completely different, but you get the point. Basically, makes it really difficult to kind of mess this up. Starting over here, you have your main 54-pin harness. This is going to connect into the chassis harness. And you can see it's got this big locking mechanism. Next, down here, we have this 8-pin. This is actually going to be for your fuel injector sub harness. When KPower made this harness, they wanted to make it super easy to be able to choose whatever injector style you want. And most injector manufacturers have their own sort of proprietary type of plug. Or at the very least, they're using a different type of plug. So not all injectors use the exact same port. And so here is the injector sub harness that they gave me. I am going to be using Graham's 1000cc injectors. And so obviously these have different plugs specifically for those. So this guy will plug into that 8-pin sensor so that you don't have to worry about, if they pre-made it for, say, stock, K24 style injectors, you'd have to snip those wires and then solder them all together. Like, they make it super easy by doing it this way. Next, you've got this guy. This is a 3-pin. This is actually for your AC compressor. You've got your knock sensor, is this little almost teardrop shape connector there. You have a mounting clamp. Basically, there's a spot on the engine above the starter, I believe, that this one bolts into. And of course, we'll show you all of that. This guy is for the alternator. And then to round off this end, we've got the throttle body, which we're reusing the stock Subaru BRZ Scion FRS throttle body. And you've got a map sensor connector, 3-pin, and I believe this 2-pin is for maybe intake air temp. But that pretty much rounds out this first leg of the wiring harness, and this is the shorter half. So coming over here to look at the longer side of the harness, you have a pair of 3-pin sensors. These are for your camshaft position sensors. This 2-pin right here is for the coolant temp, which is in the aluminum coolant water neck provided by KPower. And you have a grounding cable. This will connect into the back of the block, I believe. Obviously, we'll see when we get there. And then you have your 4 coil pack connectors that are these larger 3-pin with the light blue interior on them. So you've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. You have another mounting set and another ground clip. And coming over here, we've got these last 4 sensors all the way down at the end. We've got a 2-pin for the VTEC solenoid. You've got this larger, really big boy clip sensor here. And this is for the sensor that does both oil temp and pressure. So you've got one sensor that does both of those. That's really nice. You've got your VTEC actuator, which is a little 2-pin right here. And then this last 3-pin all the way down at the end is your crankshaft position sensor. So now that we've done, kind of a general wrap up here of looking at it on the tabletop, let's go throw it in the car and look at it a little bit closer. All right, so now that we've talked about the harness a little bit, let's talk about the wiring inside of the engine bay. So this is your main harness. If you have not already, I believe from stock, this guy is actually wrapped down around this side to connect to the stock FA20. But as you can see, we have retaped and re-loomed all of that very nicely. You've got your 54-pin chassis harness connector. You've got the old 8-pin injector harness, which we don't need because this is basically being obsoleted by the injector harness that we have on the new wiring harness. This connects to this little sort of 5-point star looking thing, connects to part of the starter wiring. And then these two guys right here are for the stock transmission. I believe these are gear position sensors. So like if you're in first gear, second gear, third gear, obviously because we're using a CD009 and not the stock trans, we are not going to be using these. Those are just going to be loose. Now you could, if you want to cut this open, pull these guys out. If you're using a CD trans, if you're using a stock BRZ trans and you want to have your gear position, go for that, keep those there. And you could also remove this injector sub harness, which again, mine's already taped up and everything. I'm just going to leave them there. If you want it to look super clean, even though the intake manifold is going to be here covering all this up, if you want to remove them, you're more than welcome to do so. So that sort of covers everything on this side. Now let's talk about the starter wiring. I am using a K24 starter because of the fact that that is what Collins, the company that makes my transmission adapter for the K to the CD, recommended that I use a standard K24 starter. If you're using the KPower setup and you're using a stock BRZ trans, they recommend that you use a K20 starter because that's just what they decided to go with for their setup. So on either option, you're going to have two different things that you need to connect. Basically, you have your signal wire, which connects into this, and then you have your grounding wire. And for the stock wiring, obviously my battery is pulled out right now, but I believe this is the negative terminal. I'm not positive on that, don't quote me on it, but this terminal has these cables, which are for the starter. Normally the starter on the FA is on this side of the engine versus that side. So this guy is going to get routed down behind the engine and all the way up to the front here. So you've got these two wires here. This, the sensor or the sort of connector piece on your signal wire, will need to be removed and some heat shrink added. This is all in the installation guide as well, so they've got pictures there. And this guy right here is your grounding wire. These tabs need to be flattened out from the little 90 degrees, but those will connect onto this guy. So you have your signal, you have your ground. And that should more or less cover your starter wiring. VTEC solenoid signals to the ECU to have the VTEC actuator open up. That will lock the big lobes in place so they become active. And that comes from this guy. This is your actuator. This is what actually sends the oil pressure to those pins to lock that out. Down here we have the Bosch oil temperature and pressure sensor. This came from the KPower electronics pack. So if you buy like the harness, the ECU, the jumper board, and all of that stuff from KPower, I believe they include this sensor. So you only need one sensor to do both oil temp and oil pressure. So that's just convenient. You're eliminating one extra sensor that you need. And then I think this should be the last one or close to it. This is your crankshaft position sensor. So this measures the position of the crankshaft. Now there is one extra thing that we need to do in here over by the battery case, and it's for the alternator. The alternator needs a ground to the basically the chassis, the frame of the car. So you have your normal plug, but then you also got a ground that goes right here. Yeah, so you have a ground wire, and that is also included in the KPower package. It's this guy. It's got this big red plug. My cables are sort of all over the place right now, but so what we're gonna do is once you have the battery out, you need to undo this 10 mil bolt and this 10 millimeter bolt, this guy right down here, that 10 mil bolt, pull out this little bracket, and then all you really need to do is flatten this sort of ear that comes up. If you hammer that down, flatten it out, this is where you're going to attach the ground for your alternator cable. So here's that little bracket that we needed to take out for the alternator ground. All we're going to do is just bend this little ear down so that it's flat with this surface. That way we can, I don't know if it's intended to use both of these bolt hole mounts, It might do. They might have built it specifically for that, which would be quite convenient. So let's get that hammered out and flattened. I'm gonna hit this with some degreaser because it's a little bit gross, but really not too big a deal. And we may end up just spraying this black altogether, because once we open this up, that metal on the inside might kind of want to crack open or something, but I don't know. Let's see. That's how it looks right now. Obviously it didn't flatten out perfectly straight. It kind of has a little bit of a hook in it, but we'll see if we can't, I'm gonna throw it back in the car and just see if I need to make an adjustment. Yeah, so this little hump right here is causing a little bit of an issue. I'm gonna keep working on this and see if we can't try to flatten that out a bit. Didn't make a whole lot of progress on getting that little hump out of there, but I think that should be fine. I don't think that's really going to be too much of a problem. Basically, the material here in this little corner is kind of bent up, so it doesn't really want to flatten out too much more than that, but I think that should be just fine. Let's go ahead and throw this back in. So here we have our alternator grounding cable. I'm going to just go ahead and unbolt the cable from this base plate. This base plate with these two here is what bolts into that little bracket that we just modified. So I'm going to take this off and we will mount up the bracket, and then we'll come back in and put the cable back on. So with that bracket flattened out, you can see that that is pretty much how it's going to sit. The other mounting position is right here, so that's just a 10 mil bolt. So this guy is the mounting bracket for it, and so that is going to mount right down in there with two 10 mil bolts. Now, one of those came out of that position. The other one didn't have any hardware originally. So any 10 mil-ish size bolt that'll fit through that hole, that'll also fit through that hole right there, is what you're going to want to use. So what this actually is, I've actually been kind of misspeaking. I've been saying that it's a grounding cable, an alternator grounding cable, which I suppose it kind of is. It attaches back here onto the back of your alternator, runs around the back of the engine bay this direction, and will bolt onto this mounting bracket. Now what is going there is actually what comes out of the bottom of your fuse box is this guy right here. And now this is the original stock BRZ alternator wire, and this is the original connector for your alternator. Obviously, as a part of our harness, we've got a different connector, so you're not really going to be using this green pin, but this guy is going to need to come over here, connect onto the top of this red bracket, and then at the same time you're going to have this extension wire that's running behind the engine is going to make its way up here and go on the very top. I just lost one of my washers. But yeah, so all this is really doing is just extending the signal that this guy provides. With the engine bay side of things, we are going to now jump in and start looking at what we need to do for the ECU. Now, the first thing is getting the glove box out of the way. I believe you've got a little flathead screw right here that connects to this little arm that supports it. I think everything else more or less just kind of pops out. Not sure. Like, yeah, this little pin right here by my thumb, I think if you squeeze this in, that comes out. It's supported by two sets of hinges, one here and one there, but those should more or less come off once we get it unbolted from the top, and then we can access everything down under here. I also have some old sensors that I am going to be removing for these gauges that I had for my old turbo kit, because of the fact that I'm going to be running a digital dash. I don't need any of these, so all of those sensors are going to be removed. All the wires are going to get pulled. So let's see if we can't get this glove box pulled out. This thing just pulls off the side. That it's like a soft, or basically a hard rubber on this here sort of end piece. So all you do is just pull that off to the side, and then whenever you want to go put it back in, you just push it back on, and it reinstalls itself. So this just pulls out sideways, and oh, there's two. Yep, there you go. Cables, I think this box is gonna have to come out. I think this outer shroud is gonna have to come out. Yeah, because we need to be able to access this ECU right here. So, flathead screws, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's it. Definitely helps to have the seats out while doing this, and because of the fact that I had to take the seats out whenever I did my transmission mount, we've just been leaving them out for now, so that's actually pretty convenient just to already have the seats out of the way. And the last thing that you need to do in order to be able to get this guy pulled out is actually there's a panel over here on the side, just a plastic trim piece. Try to get a flathead screwdriver wedged up, and this is all just clips, so once you kind of wedge it out, you can pull this piece off, and then you'll be able to access this from the underside. Alright, got this little guy pulled off from there. Set that aside in our glove box. And now, I'll try and come around the side and show you guys. So here from the side, there's two clips that you'll need to do. One back here, you basically just press this. There's a little flap here, so you press that inward, and that should allow you to pull this forward a little bit. And then there's another clip back here somewhere that you've also got to get. And it should let you pull this out. If you need to replace your cabin air filter while you're in here, that's it right there. Pull this guy out. Oh, that is looking pretty bad. I will make sure to run to the hardware store and grab a new one of these, because that looks like garbage. Alright, well, I think I'm going to give up on trying to just fully pull this out. This plastic trim piece connects to this. It's the same, it's all the same piece. There's no disconnecting this piece from that piece. Why the hell they didn't just make this separate from that, I have no earthly idea. Thanks, Subaru. But this is also this, which holds your climate control in place, which is also the same piece here, which is also the same piece that bolts in and holds your OBD2 port. Why? Why? I've undone so many different things, and this is still, like, I disconnected the trim piece underneath the steering wheel. I disconnected the trim piece above the gauge like, it's been like 3 hours that I've just been trying to pull this out. So at the very most, undo all your screws, maybe undo a couple of these bolts and try and pull this out to get this a little bit more free. I am done with this. So I'm going to see if I can show you guys what you need to get to here. So you've got this 10 mil bolt right here, and then there's that 10 mil bolt right all the way back there. So those two 10 mils, and you'll be able to pull your stock ECU out. So I'm trying to show you guys how this connects into there. So you see right here, the ECU is kind of hooked onto the top of that stud, and then you got the same thing all the way at the back. Again, kind of hard to show, very hard to show. Okay, I failed to notice that there's also these two 10 millimeter bolts right there. So we'll get those pulled off. Oh, sorry, this is not this here that I just unbolted from the front, but those two 10 mil bolts is not the ECU that we're looking for. This is just another relay board, but it needed to be removed one way or the other. SMT main ECU assembly. We're gonna actually try and get to the jumper board housing, which were those two long bolts that were really far away all the way in the back. That's the guy right there. That's the one.
Now that we have the stock ECU box out of the car, there's a couple of things that we need to do. First, we need to remove this guy so that we can get our KPower jumper board put into this box, but also you can see that the stock box has these 4 connectors, as does the jumper board. However, this has 2 connectors here that are used to actually jump to your Haltech Elite 1500. So this not only needs to be removed, but the outer box, this black plastic box, need to be cut open so that these can slide through the back on this slot here. So first of all, let's go ahead and get this guy pulled out, and we'll talk about how we're going to cut the back of this. Basically, you've just got 4 clips, 2 on each side, these 2 and these 2, and that should take this little plastic cover off right here, and then hopefully that's all we need to do to be able to pull out this stock piece. There it is. All right, so now make sure we get that side popped off, this side. All right, so now you take off your little plastic case, plastic cover that is. See if this guy just slides. Yep, that just slides right out. Look at that. So that's your stock ECU board right there. So you can see the difference. This obviously has a lot more modules on it, a lot more everything, but because of the fact that all this is doing is transferring the data brought in on these 4 sensors from the chassis harness to these 2 sensors, and then this is just going to convey over to the Haltech Elite to do all of the hard work. So now let's talk about what we need to do with this box. So we need to open up the back of this slot so that whenever we go to drop our new board in here, it actually is able to go all the way through and feed through the back here. So let's just kind of take some measurements, and I'll mark where I'm gonna cut. I'll probably end up just using a Dremel and a small little cutting wheel just to basically cut a little rectangular slot out of the back of this. That is most likely what's gonna happen. So here's how the first attempt came out. Want to focus? There we go. So we're pretty close. Overcut a little bit on this side. And what are you gonna do? Undercut on this side a little bit. So we're just gonna, obviously, like, I'm gonna go back through and clean all this up so it doesn't have a bunch of plastic bits. But pretty close. So, yeah, as you can see, I did end up cutting away more than I really needed to, but it is all the way in. The way that I inserted this, if I didn't clarify this previously, is with the green board and all of the wiring on the top side where this bracket goes. At least that's how I remember pulling it off. So that way that these sensors are offset, you can see how they're kind of offset from the center. They're shifted this way towards the mounting bracket. All we do is take our little plastic bits everywhere. And so this guy, so you can see there's a thin side on the top, and there's a thicker side on the bottom. So this is gonna go with the thin side facing up to where this bracket is mounted. Just place this back over top, make sure everything goes in, and snap her in. And there you go. Now you can shake it. There's no rattling. It's not moving around in there at all. That is pretty dang secure. Cool. So with our modified ECU jumper board box here, we can take our connecting wiring harness, hook this into this, and then we will be getting this guy reinstalled in this orientation with these 2 hooks pointing left towards the driver's side. You got a larger connector and a smaller connector, big, little, and you've got a larger one and a smaller one. So stick these together. There's 1 and there's 2. Because of the fact that all of these wires are going to be facing backwards, this harness, this jumper harness, essentially needs to be able to face forward to connect to the Haltech Elite 1500,
And this extra little harness here is actually for one of the parts of the wideband sensor. So let's talk about that really quick. So here is our Haltech Elite wideband sort of connector, as well as your little wideband ECU here, if you will, or your controller, really, your wideband controller. And so this has the wideband sensor itself connected through a cable down to the controller. Now, there's a couple of other cables that it comes with that allow you to connect this to the jumper board as well as the ECU. So now we have the jumper board with the jumper board harness, the big guy that connects to the Haltech. And then we have here at the top on your female connector, we have this longer cable that will connect to your wideband controller. Because your wideband controller essentially takes the signal that it receives from the sensor, feeds it into this cable, and then this signal goes into the smaller wire here, the female end, and then the male end goes to the ECU. All right, so having the bracket installed on this ECU box was making it really difficult to be able to plug these 4 sets of connectors in. So what I did, was take the bracket off. Basically, you just put a little flathead up underneath each of these sides, pry upwards, and then you can slide it off. Flathead under that end, pry it off. And then I was able to get the ECU, or really the jumper board, up in here, get those 4 sensors connected. Now, I'm just gonna get this bracket, slide it back onto the jumper board, and then bolt it in. Stupid trim piece, God! So now we've got the jumper board box right here with those 4 connectors, and we've got all the way up in here, right up through that set of wires right there, is the jumper harness that is folded over and is poking out down here at the bottom. I've got my 10 mil bolt for the bottom of that bracket right there, and I've got the other 10 mil for the top right here. So now we can take this guy, this other little sort of solenoid, get these 3 connectors put back in, and then installed on these 2 bolt holes right here. These guys have little pins on the bottom. The top connector is the smallest of the 3, so that obviously goes in the small connector slot. This one has 2 little sort of valleys, or kind of cutouts on the bottom side, and the one on the end has 3. So you have the smallest one. This has 2 cutouts on one side of the connector. This one has 3 cutouts on one side of the connector. What I did was I ended up taking this solenoid back out. I unbolted the bracket for that ECU jumper board so that I could move the jumper board back a little bit, and I actually pulled these wires, which previously were coming out from down here, out around this way, and I was able to run them back through this gap. Now, this is going to allow me to be able to get the ECU plugged into those 2 connectors right there, and I will actually be able to mount it where KPower recommends, right up in here, sort of mounting it to this extra bracketing. And one of the things that I was kind of concerned about is this raw sort of stamped sheet metal here was a little bit sharp on the edge, and even though this is loomed, I just didn't want to have any kind of rubbing and or cutting going on. So if you have, like, sort of rubber, like weather stripping almost, that's small enough to go on this edge, I think that would probably be ideal. I don't have any of that, so I just double layered some electrical tape on there, and it's a lot smoother. We're not kind of catching on that metal anymore. The wideband sensor itself is actually going to need to go down through the opening for the shifter. So basically this wiring is going to need to go up behind the trim because of the fact that this sensor is going to need to come down this way and loop down in here. So the wire is gonna need to go more or less something like this. Goes up through this gap right here in the trim. As for the wideband controller, there are 2 plugs here. I don't think it really matters which one you use, but I'm gonna be using the left one. So we're using this one because that is the one that KPower had in their installation guide. The picture had it in this port, so we're just gonna stick with that for now. This is going to be the plug for your actual wideband sensor, is gonna come in here. The other end of this goes to the ECU jumper board, which we already have plugged in. And then it's the feed to the ECU goes from that jumper board plug, which is all the way down here, which we pre-installed. This guy is gonna go into your Haltech. This yellow cable that comes with the Haltech ECU is just basically the connection between your computer and the ECU itself. This is just gonna stay wrapped up inside of the glove box so that whenever we go to take it to our tuner, all we gotta do is pop the glove box open, grab this cable, boop, hook it into the laptop, and start tuning. So because of that, I'm gonna run this back through this just main slot here. Get that guy plugged into the connector all the way on the right side. Now we're gonna hook up our main ECU jumper harness, the 2 big connectors on the bottom here. All right, now that we've got our ECU up by this bracket, I gotta find a good way to zip tie this thing on there. All right, Haltech is mounted up. I'm gonna do my best to try and show you guys what I did. So you've got one of those little loopholes on the side. Yeah, so you got one loophole on the side right there that goes into the top hole right here, because the bottom one is used to mount this trim piece. And then my other one, try and use an arrow here to point out what I'm looking at. But you can see the zip tie there. There's a tiny little hole all the way up in the right-hand corner, up in there, of this same little L, or really kind of elbow bracket, whatever the hell piece you want to call it. And so I've got the other zip tie up there going through another one of those mounting holes on the side. And so here is kind of what it looks like. So we've got our connectors at the bottom hooked up. We've got our wideband connector coming from the jumper board. And then we're gonna get our little yellow connecting cable here, this guy, hooked up, and then that'll be the ECU mounted. So now that we've got the Haltech ECU installed, all we really need to do is to get our wideband sensor plugged into our wideband controller, this guy right here, reconnect our yellow Haltech sort of connection cable, connects the ECU to a computer, and that's pretty much it. Everything else after that, just gonna be reinstalling all of your interior, and then the wiring will be done. Just like that, all of our interior is back together. I even replaced these 2 trim pieces up top. I had the one with those 3 gauges, which I was gonna remove. As earlier, I mentioned that I'm getting a digital dash, so I don't need these gauges. Everything's gonna be displayed there. And I also had like a fake carbon piece here that I replaced. Eventually, I'm going to paint these some kind of fancy color, I'm sure. But yeah, with that pretty much concludes all of the wiring. And that's gonna wrap it up for this one, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for following along. I hope you're enjoying and getting some use out of this if you are following this to do the build yourself. If you did enjoy this, then make sure to give it a thumbs up down below. Subscribe to the channel so you can stay up to date on the build and see all the new videos coming up next. And until next time, build your dreams.